women. We owe those 14 women, but we also owe to work for our daughters, sisters, mothers, and ourselves because we are all Canadians. Thank you.
The members of Sarnia-Lambton for sending me back to represent them in this 43rd Parliament. Today, I rise to honor and remember the victims of the tragic massacre at École Polytechnique 30 years ago. As the first female engineer in the House of Commons, it is fitting for me to pay tribute. These women were my sisters. I name them now to respect them for the strong women they are and they were. Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Croghan, Nathalie Crotu, Barbara Daignon, Anne-Marie Edward, Maude Haviernik, Maryse Lagagnère, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelcher, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Arsenault, Annie Turcotte, Barbara Kluzek-Wijawik. We must each do more to prevent such acts of violence in our country, especially those that specifically target women. May we never forget them.
The honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, young people have been taking to the streets calling for action on the climate crisis. Yes. They are worried about our future. They don't need more pretty words. They need action now. They want ambitious targets, a Green New Deal, and for the government to wake up. Instead, the Liberals are hitting the snooze button, kicking targets from 2030 to 2050. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are tired of this government's empty words, declaring a climate emergency one day and approving a pipeline the next. They promised to end fossil fuel subsidies, but still hand out billions to big oil and gas companies. Mr. Speaker, COP25 is a time to announce real action, investing in green jobs, power, transit, and housing, eliminating all fossil fuel subsidies, and putting tougher emissions targets into law. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are counting on us.
Yes.
The honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to remember a great Quebecer, Mr. Claude Bélan, who left us on November 24th last at the age of 87. He was the CEO of the Mouvement Desjardins until 2000, and he embodied the best of Quebec. He believed in co-ops, and we owe him in part the fact that in Quebec, the co-op movement is strongest. He was a humanist, a real one, and he felt that the economy should work for people and not the opposite. He was far from the cold-blooded bankers that we often cross in the real world. In Quebec, he was part of the generation of giants who led Quebec's quiet revolution, and we owe him a great debt to this day. He was the most noble embodiment of what was best about Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Bélan. You still inspire us, and you will keep on inspiring us for a very long time. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, today we mark the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. This day has been set aside to commemorate the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history that occurred at Montreal's École Polytechnique, where 14 women were murdered. Today marks the 30th anniversary of this tragedy. It reminds us of the daughters, sisters, and friends who lost their lives. These victims were all women with bright futures whose families will never have the opportunity to see them flourish. Throughout Canada, communities and organizations are joining together to commemorate this day and to continue our efforts to fight for a world free from violence against women. I would like to finish with an excerpt from a poem written by Wadea Samdi titled Finding Freedom. My makeup does not cover my bruised face. My smile does not hide my haggard visage. yet no one comes to help. They say, it will get better. They say, don't talk about it. They say, this was my fate. They say, a woman must tolerate. Don't air your dirty laundry, they say. When will this end? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Toronto Danforth.
Il y a 30 ans, j'étais une étudiante à
30 years ago, I was a student in Montreal, and I still remember the shock I felt when I heard about the shooting at the Polytechnique and that the violence specifically targeted women.
an action on violence against women. It's a day of remembrance, but it's also a day of action. Prenons l'action pour
So let's take concrete action to end violence against women.
and let's make donations, donate our time, donate money to support them. Prenons l'action.
So let's do something to bring about better gun control.
Families of Polytechnique have asked us through their group, Poly se souvient. We need to have stronger control and ban handguns and assault weapons. That is what they've asked of us. Let's join together as we remember the women from Polytechnique. Let's not forget what we need to do. We need to end violence against women. We need to introduce stronger gun control. Let us do it. It's the least we can do in their memory.
Bravo.
Oral questions, question orale. The honourable leader of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this morning we learned that 71,000 jobs have been lost in Canada last month. Alberta and BC lost 18,000 and 45,000 jobs were lost in Quebec. This is a serious economic crisis from coast to coast. Why did the government not mention that in the throne speech? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we take very seriously these job losses. We will always work hard to support the middle class, to help Canadians prosper in an uncertain world. That's what we'll continue to do. The plan we set forth yesterday would help the middle class, strengthen it, fight climate change, and create new job opportunities for Canadians while protecting Canadians and keeping them in health all across the country. That is precisely what we will keep doing. We will also take into consideration Canadians who have lost their jobs.
Status quo isn't working. His plan is leading to jobs leaving this country. In fact, under this Prime Minister, foreign investors are rushing for the exits. Foreign direct investment is down 56% on his watch. And today's job losses are the worst since the 2008 financial crisis. So again, with all signs pointing to an economic downturn, why did this Prime Minister fail to mention any of that in his speech from the throne?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
From the throne, we recognize the challenges facing workers in our resource sector. With the lower prices on international commodities, there have been some very difficult times for workers, particularly in the prairies. That is why, after many years of trying and failing by previous governments, we are moving forward on building the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. There are shovels in the ground. There are thousands of Canadians newly hired to make sure that we can get our energy resources to new markets responsibly and sustainably.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is going to spend the next few weeks and months trying to blame everything else except for his failure for the challenges facing this economy. Other countries are increasing their investments in natural resource development. In fact, the United States has gone from a net consumer to a net exporter of energy. So there's clearly countries around the world that are getting it right. He's getting it wrong. The Montreal Economic Institute has stated that people are giving up on Canada as a safe place to invest in natural resources. It's seen as a very hostile environment now. Why does the Prime Minister continue with this failed approach?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Failed approach is choosing to do less to fight climate change, choosing to do less to listen to Indigenous communities and work with other communities to get things done. That approach of blaming foreign activists didn't get pipelines built during their time in office. What we are doing now is actually getting our resources to new markets with shovels in the ground right now. We also drew in the largest private sector investment in Canadian history with the $40 billion LNG Canada investment, and we're going to keep working on bringing in investment to create good jobs for Canadians right across the country.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, deep cracks are showing in Confederation, and the Prime Minister has divided this country like it has never been before. But he has managed to unite provincial premiers around one thing: their opposition to his failed approach on Bill C-69. So will the Prime Minister listen to the voices of our premiers, all regions of this country, and commit to overhauling his approach on C-69?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, as we move forward on C-69, we adopted many of the proposals put forward by industry, by various parties to improve and amend that proposition. We are looking forward to working with all concerned partners on ensuring its proper implementation and making improvements if necessary. But we recognize that the current approach of SIA 2012 is not working. If you look at the Springbank Dam in Calgary, if you look at the Lake Winnipeg outlet that are delayed under the previous process, C-69 will help in moving forward concretely.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, recently the Liberal government voted for an anti-Israel resolution at the United Nations. The Prime Minister's hand-picked ambassador to the UN even went so far as to brag that the vote showed, quote, Canada has found its voice by opposing the only democracy in the Middle East. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what his ambassador meant by that?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Strong friend to Israel. We maintain our opposition to the singling out of Israel unfairly at the United Nations and have voted against the vast majority of these Israel-related votes. Canada is committed to the goal of comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. In keeping with Canada's long-standing position, it's important at this time to restate our commitment to a two-state solution and the equal rights and self-determinations of peoples.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Premier of Quebec and provincial premiers met and unanimously called for an increase in health transfers by 5.2%. And it's not the Government of Canada that hires nurses and doctors. It's the Government of Quebec that does that. And yet a few days later, in the throne speech, there's this still very deeply ingrained federal tendency to encroach on Quebec's jurisdiction. Did the Prime Minister hear the unanimous call from the premiers, the Honourable Prime Minister? Mr. Speaker, transfers have been negotiated with the provinces over the years, and we've signed a deal with all provinces, including Quebec, to promise a bright future for our healthcare system in Canada. In the last election, we proposed $6 billion more to be invested in health priorities that the Quebec government shares with us, and we will work together with them to ensure that all Canadians have access to a family doctor, have access to pharmacare, and to mental health support services as well. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Shouldn't working together start with respecting their jurisdiction in the same sense that on the environment, the premiers called for environmental assessments in Quebec and the provinces to take precedence over federal assessments so that projects respect the priorities of Quebec and the provinces. Will the Prime Minister also turn a deaf ear on that file? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've often heard this concern about overlapping jurisdictions when it comes to environmental assessments and that will slow down projects. And that's why we enacted C-69, which will make it easier to work together to ensure greater clarity for investors and promoters for major projects and a better partnership on the environment and an understanding of the concerns of various communities, including Indigenous ones.
Mr. Speaker, across Canada, people are making difficult choices every day about cutting their pills in half or going without the life-saving medication that they need. Les gens méritent des leaders qui ont le...
People deserve leaders who have the guts to stand up to the major pharmaceuticals and to fight for pharmacare.
For the Prime Minister to keep his word and to deliver pharmacare that covers all Canadians.
Here, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no Canadian should have to choose between putting food on the table or paying for their essential medications. That's why we've done more than any government in history to lower drug prices for Canadians. We recognize that now is the time to do more and to move forward towards national universal pharmacare. But we recognize, as the leader of the Bloc Québécois brought up, that there is an issue of provincial jurisdictions. That's why we are going to sit down with the provinces and work with them as we move forward on ensuring that Canadians can afford the medications they need. That is the future of healthcare, and it is something we will do.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
See, there's a difference between saying the right things and actually doing them. Le Tribunal des droits de la personne.
The Human Rights Tribunal declared that your government has deliberately discriminated against Indigenous children.
These kids to court. What kind of Prime Minister does that? Quel genre de
What kind of Prime Minister does that?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we agree. Indigenous children who've suffered through past government policies need to be compensated, and that is exactly what we will do. Just as we have done in the situation of the 60s group of TB and relocations, we will be compensating those children, now adults, for the harms they suffered. We will be working with all parties and partners to ensure that we are compensating them justly and adequately, as we have done in past situations.
I just want to remind the honourable members that we place our questions through the chair. I know some of us have had experiences in some provincial legislatures where you go directly across, but I just want to remind everyone that you go directly through or go through the chair to place any questions or any statements. Thank you. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is through you to the Prime Minister, and I would appreciate the Prime Minister answering on behalf of his government. Next week, we mark 1 year since Canadian citizens Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were imprisoned by the Chinese state in an act of retaliation against a lawful arrest of a Chinese citizen. 12 months, 2 ministers, 2 ambassadors, 0 progress. What is the Prime Minister's plan to get our citizens home?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
It is our absolute priority is the well-being and safety of the Canadians which are detained in China. The Prime Minister raised these cases with President Xi and President Trump at the G20 and more recently at the NATO summit. On my third day as Foreign Minister of Canada, Mr. Speaker, on November 23rd, I raised these cases directly with my Chinese counterpart. We have rallied an unprecedented number of partners around the world in support of Canada's position, and we will continue to raise these cases at every opportunity. We will always defend Canadians around the world, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another thing the Foreign Affairs Minister said to Chinese media was that in an uncertain world, China is a model of stability, predictability, rule of law, and an inclusive society. We know the Chinese communist regime has illegally detained 2 Canadians And the Chinese ambassador dares suggest that what we do here could be viewed as foreign interference in Chinese domestic affairs. Can the minister tell us if the Chinese communist regime is still such an inspiration to him? The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. Canadians know that one country that inspires those values is Canada. That's what people elsewhere in the world recognize. If my colleague misunderstood what I said in an interview several years ago, I would remind him that everyone knows that it's Canada that inspires the rest of the world.
Wood St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, since 2006, Canada has stood on principle against the annual Israel bashing at the UN. This year, the Liberals supported a hateful motion by North Korea, the PLO, and others. Worse still, our ambassador bragged that Canada had, quote, found its voice. Mr. Speaker, what exactly did the ambassador mean when he said that?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I'd like to thank the colleague for the question. Canadians know we are a strong friend of Israel. We maintain our opposition to the singling out of Israel unfairly at the UN and have voted against the vast majority of these Israel-related votes. Canada is committed, Mr. Speaker, to a goal of comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. In keeping with Canada's long-standing position, which have been expressed by our government, it is important at this time to restate our commitment to a two-state solution, and we will always stand for Israel.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't simply a matter of another Liberal foreign policy train wreck to be shrugged off. Canada has broken faith with the only democracy in the Middle East, given comfort to tyrants and hate mongers, and betrayed the Canadian Jewish community after offering election campaign promises of solidarity, as when the member for Mount Royal earnestly offered the Liberal record speaks for itself. Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, it does. Is this faithlessness of Liberal Canadian foreign policy merely in reckless pursuit of tainted Security Council votes?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the colleague for the question. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, our records speak for itself. Canadians and the Jewish community which are watching, Mr. Speaker, know that we're a strong friend of Israel, that would have stood up for Israel, and I would say, Mr. Speaker, we maintain...
I just want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the chair, not directly across when it's not their turn to speak. I'm having a hard time hearing the answer. I'm sure we all want to hear the answer from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'll let him continue now, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it's more of the same. If they were listening, perhaps they would be able to appreciate what we're saying. Mr. Speaker, we maintain our opposition to the singling out of Israel unfairly at the UN, and as they know well, and as the world know well, we have voted against the vast majority of the Israeli-related votes. We will stand with Israel, Mr. Speaker, and Canadians know.
I just want to remind honourable members on both sides of the House that respect is a two-way street, and it has to go both ways. So blaming someone for something that really isn't right when you're doing it yourself doesn't go over well. The Honourable Member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
More and more Canadians have stopped believing the Prime Minister when he says Canada is back. Every single trip abroad ends in disaster. Examples abound. Just think of his ill-fated trip to India. It was a fiasco. His most recent appearance at the NATO summit is further proof of his undiplomatic conduct. Is the Prime Minister finally going to get the message and quit embarrassing Canada abroad?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to assure my honourable colleagues and all Canadians that the Prime Minister is an excellent representative of our country abroad, especially when it comes to our crucial relations with the United States. And I'd like to reassure all Canadians that we have a very constructive relationship with the United States today. The Prime Minister has a very constructive bilateral relationship with the President of the United States. And just this morning, I spoke with Ambassador Lighthizer about NAFTA, and I'll be speaking with him right after question period.
For Aurora Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are not reassured. Canadians continue to lose confidence in the Prime Minister's ability to defend our interests abroad. His diplomatic disasters continue to mount. His trip to India was a failure. He angered our partners in Asia Pacific. Our ties with Saudi Arabia are frozen, and our relationships with China are at an all-time low. And now his actions this week at NATO is further evidence of his undiplomatic behavior. When will this Prime Minister stop embarrassing Canada and just stay home?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to assure honourable members in this House, but above all Canadians, that our Prime Minister is an excellent representative of our country abroad. And crucially, because this is something that Canadians care about, because it affects their daily lives, that we have an excellent relationship with the United States, led by the relationship the Prime Minister has, the excellent working relationship he has with President Trump. Thank you.
L'honorable député. The honourable member for Montarville. Mr. Speaker, since the throne speech, the government led off with a call for unity in the pursuit of common goals. And that's precisely what Quebec and the provinces did last week at the Council of the Federation. All premiers called for a 5.2% increase in health transfers. Funding health care for our loved ones is the #1 priority of all of our constituents. Will the Prime Minister respect this unity between Quebec and the rest of the provinces and increase health transfers? The Honourable Minister of Health.
Speaker, it's an honor to rise in this House and respond to my honourable colleague's question. And I first would like to thank the members of the constituents of Thunder Bay Superior North for sending me here to be able to do this phenomenal job on their behalf. As the Prime Minister indicated, we've committed an additional $6 billion. We've made this commitment to ensure that every Canadian has access to health services in their province or territory that will meet the growing needs of our country and the changing needs of our country. And of course, we will work closely with our provincial and territorial partners to make sure that those services reflect the needs of the residents where they live. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, everyone agrees health transfers need increasing. The government says it wants everyone to have a family doctor. Well, transfer the money to Quebec. They want better mental health care. Well, give us the means to do it, Mr. Speaker. We have the expertise. Will the government listen and meet the unanimous demand from Quebec and the provinces for an increase in health transfers?
Speaker, Canadians are rightfully proud of their public health care system. It's something that we all know is the first point of pride for Canadians, whether they travel abroad or whether people visit Canada. And of course, we're going to work incredibly hard with provinces and territories to protect this institution, to grow the institution, to meet the changing needs of Canadians all across the country, and to make sure that we work closely with provinces and territories to get it right. Canadians are expecting us to do that on their behalf.
The honourable member, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals didn't do much about Quebec's demands in the last Parliament. Demands about a single tax return, about the third link, and about illegal border crossings in Quebec, just to mention a few. I have a very simple question for the Prime Minister today. Can he say clearly if Quebec will be able to have a single tax return like everywhere else in Canada, yes or no?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue.
Emploie plus de 6 000 personnes partout.
Revenue Canada employs thousands of people in places like Shawinigan and Jonquière. Unlike the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, we will not jeopardize those jobs. We are willing, however, to work with Revenue Quebec to facilitate the tax filing requirements for Quebecers. The Conservatives and the Bloc should be ashamed, but I'm not surprised that they will propose policies that would jeopardize regional workers.
The Richmond now.
The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. I'd like to remind my honourable colleague that this request came from the National Assembly. It was a unanimous request of all political parties in Quebec without exception. Clearly, the Liberals do not want to address specific demands from Quebec. There was nothing in the throne speech about those demands. So I repeat I have another simple question. Can the Prime Minister tell us clearly today if he will commit to supporting Quebec City's Third Link project, yes or no? The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, on this day when we're celebrating the loss of 14 young women's lives, I would encourage everyone here to think not of rhetoric, but of action. And we are investing $5.2 billion in transportation, in public transit infrastructure in the Quebec City area over the next 10 years. We know that the Third Link project is important for people on the south shore of Quebec City. We will continue to monitor this file, and we are open to proposals.
Mr. Speaker, the BC forestry industry is in crisis. Thousands have been laid off and more job losses expected before the holidays. The speech from the throne yesterday failed to mention it. They will not even acknowledge a crisis exists. This government failed to negotiate a softwood lumber agreement, and the Prime Minister's antics at NATO may have destroyed any opportunity to get a deal done. Yep. What is their plan to get forestry workers in BC back to work?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the member opposite for the very important question. The forestry industry is an absolutely essential industry for Canada and one that all of us are deeply concerned about. We have been working hard with the forestry industry and with our provincial colleagues to support the forestry industry. And when it comes to the softwood lumber tariffs, we are taking cases at NAFTA and at the WTO. We have preserved Chapter 19 at NAFTA that allows us to fight for our Canadian industry, and we are prepared to talk to the Americans when they're ready to come to the table.
Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Right, and that's going well. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said he, quote, heard Western Canada and would, quote, work hard to bring our country together. But Canada is more divided than ever because of him. And still, he refuses to overhaul his anti-energy, anti-business Bill C-69 that ignited this unity crisis. As recently as Monday, every single premier in this country wants major changes to Bill C-69. So, if the Liberals are serious about dousing the fire that they lit, when will they stop their attacks on Canadian resource workers and on provinces?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Impact Assessment Act delivered on an important promise that we made in 2015 to fix a broken environmental assessment process that was gutted by the Harper Conservatives in 2012. The new process will put in place better rules that will ensure that we address issues early in the process such that good projects will move forward and be built in this country. It is an enormous step forward, both for the environment and for the economy.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
Madame Mr. Speaker, I'd first like to say congratulations to yourself and all other members for being trusted by Canadians in our roles here in the House. I'm honored to be representing my territory, Nunavut. We know that climate change is a crisis. It threatens the lives and the abilities for our hunters to provide for families and communities. We need to treat it just as is, a crisis. In Nunavut, we continue to fight for basic human rights, a safe place to live, being able to afford to feed ourselves, and clean drinking water. The Prime Minister gives billions to oil and gas companies and delays climate action for 20 years. 2050 is the target now. These companies are being put ahead of people, our Canadians. When will the government work for people?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for the question. Climate change is a crisis. Clearly, Canadians told us in the election that they want governments and all members of this House to address climate change on an urgent basis. There is no area in Canada that is more affected by climate change than the North. We must act. We must act now. We have said that we will work, and we look to other parties to work with us to exceed the target that we established for 2030 and to move towards a net zero economy in 2050. I look forward to working with my honourable colleagues to do just that.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Kuwait-Nook-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, the planet is warming, and the message is clear. We're running out of options. In the north, we can already see the impacts of climate change. The ice road season is getting shorter, and our infrastructures are in danger. The speech from the throne doesn't even mention this. Ending oil subsidies would have been a good start, or not buying pipelines, but that's not what they were suggesting. I wonder what the member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie thinks of this, as he is finally starting to discover the true face of the Liberal Party. Why are the Liberals refusing to act? The Honourable Minister for the Environment. Mr. Speaker, 2/3 of Canadians voted for serious action against climate change. This means that we need to cooperate in order to find the best solutions to fight climate change. We already have a credible and affordable plan that involves over 50 different measures developed for and by Canadians. But we know that we need to do more. We want to work together with our colleagues in this House to do more to fight climate change.
Honorable Député.
The Honourable Member for Brossard-Saint-Lambert. Mr. Speaker, 30 years ago today, a horrific act of violence against women was committed, the worst such event in our history. 14 young women were murdered in a shooting at l'École Polytechnique in Montreal, simply because they were women.
Could the Minister for Women and Gender Equality tell this House what our government is doing to ensure a safer future for women and girls in Canada? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister.
Je remercie.
I thank my colleague for Bourassa for the question.
Names of 14 women will echo in this chamber and across the country. Tonight, Parliament Hill will be lit up with 14 rays of purple light, one representing each of the lives needlessly taken 30 years ago. And every day, our government will work to further implement the gender-based violence effort we've already begun. We will respond to the calls for justice from the MMIWG inquiry. We will work to prohibit the type of assault weapon that was used by the Polytechnic shooter. We will work to pay women fairly and stand up against misogyny so that our daughters can reach their full potential.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Last month, 71,000 Canadians went home and looked their families in the eye and said, I lost my job. Half of Canadians are $200 away from insolvency. And the rate of insolvency is up 13% in just 1 year, a decade-old record. Government taxes and regulations have driven investment out, jobs down, and the cost of living up. When will they reverse course, get off the backs of Canadian workers and businesses, and let our economy get back on track?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
We, in fact, will continue on the course of investing in Canadians. We know that what we've done over the last 4 years in creating jobs has been important. We also need to recognize that as the economy goes through changes, that we need to continue making those sorts of investments. The first action of our government will be to recognize some of the challenges that Canadians face by reducing taxes for middle-class Canadians and ensuring that people actually have more money in their pockets. So I'm looking forward to the member of Carleton voting for that, recognizing that Canadians do need more money and the tax reductions are in order.
Honourable member for Carleton.
Monsieur le Président, il s'est
Mr. Speaker, the minister just congratulated himself, but he should have spoken directly to the people who lost their jobs. There were 71,000 Canadians who lost their jobs recently. The rate of insolvency is the highest it's been in a decade. It's up 13%, Mr. Speaker. When will the Minister of Finance stop living in this dream reality and face actual reality? Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we need to consider how we can improve our economy, how we can improve things for Canadians. That's our job, and that's our approach, making investments in the future and investments in families. It's very important that we continue with that approach. We have had successes in recent years, but it's true, there are still a lot of challenges that we need to consider. That's why we are thinking about how we can reduce taxes, benefit families, and help them in the future.
Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was found guilty by the Ethics Commissioner of politically interfering in the criminal prosecution of his friends at SNC-Lavalin.
Absolutely.
He blocked an investigation into his own corruption at the Justice Committee and again at the Ethics Committee. Now the Prime Minister is continuing to block the RCMP by refusing to cooperate with their investigation. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing and end his cover-up?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it is the responsibility of any Prime Minister to stand up for jobs across the country while upholding the rule of law. And we have accepted the Ethics Commission's report taking full responsibility. And we have already begun to implement the recommendations made by former Attorney General Anne McLaren.
I'm sorry, maybe the speaker's getting old and his hearing's going, but I'm having a hard time hearing the Government House Leader. So I'll just ask him to maybe continue so I can maybe hear it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So we want to ensure that going forward, governments never face this type of situation again, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, I'm back before a minority government, and this government is being very closely watched. Mr. Speaker, it's not just members on this side of the House who are keeping a close eye on the Prime Minister. The RCMP is too. The Prime Minister is preventing the RCMP from accessing documents about his political interference in the SNC-Lavalin affair. When will the government finally cooperate and give the RCMP access to those documents? Canadians want the truth. The Honourable Government Leader in the House. Well, indeed, Mr. Speaker, some things don't change. When my colleague said that the government was being closely watched, well, all parliamentarians are being closely watched by Canadians, and Canadians sent us a very clear message on October 21st. They want us to work together. They want us to try to move forward together on common issues. It's the responsibility of any Prime Minister to defend jobs across the country while respecting the rule of law. We accepted the Ethics Commissioner's report, we've accepted responsibility, and we've already started implementing the recommendations of Anne McLellan.
L'honorable député de Shefford.
Honourable Member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, in yesterday's speech from the throne, the government reaffirmed its commitment to strengthen old age pensions. That's a good thing, and it's something that we were calling for throughout the election campaign. But one thing is unclear, and I want to give the government the chance to clarify it. Does the government want to increase old age pensions starting at the age of 65, or will it create two classes of seniors?
The Honourable Minister for Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Given it's the first time I have a chance to stand and speak in the 43rd Parliament, I want to thank the people of King Vaughan for electing me again to represent them here in this House. And also want to thank the Prime Minister for giving me this opportunity to serve a very important demographic in our country, seniors, and being the Minister for Seniors. I want to assure the member with the question that our government has been working since its first days, the first days we were elected, on behalf of seniors. And we will be, as you are aware from our platform, looking at increasing the OAS, and we are looking at how we will do that, but we have committed in our platform, and we are going to be working forward on 10% increase at 75. That's what we have promised in our platform. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, the speech from the throne talked about a lot of seniors, but not all seniors. The Liberals made commitments to seniors aged 75 and up, not all seniors. But the spiral of poverty doesn't affect only those over the age of 75. All too often it starts as soon as people retire. Will the government commit to increasing old age pensions for all seniors starting at the age of 65, or will it create two classes of seniors?
The Honourable Minister for Seniors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I did hear the question and I did answer the question, so I wanted to make sure that I reiterate the work that we have been doing on behalf of seniors, and we were focusing earlier in our mandate on the more vulnerable seniors. So we have, as you know, restored the age of eligibility for old age security and guaranteed income supplement to 65, and that kept 100,000 seniors out of poverty. More recently, we supported low-income seniors who work by increasing their earnings exemption for the GIS from $3,500 to $5,000. We raised the guaranteed income supplement for single seniors, helping 900,000.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, agriculture was not even mentioned in the throne speech, but why should we be surprised? This Prime Minister is responsible for Canadian farmers losing their most important canola market. Liberal failures are crippling Canadian farm families and is only getting worse. 3 million acres of canola are buried under the snow. And because of the Liberal carbon tax, the cost of drying grain is skyrocketing.
That's right.
When is this Prime Minister going to stand with farmers, stand up to China, and regain market access for our canola?
The Honourable Minister,
Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are standing with our ranchers and farmers. This is very important. We are working with them through a working committee with the provinces, with the industry. We are doing different things to support them and to reopen the market in China. We have started conversation through the WTO. We are having technical discussions with Chinese officials. We have our Ambassador Barton who's working hard in the field, and we keep working with the industry here in Canada as well.
Honourable Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Farmers are hurting in Ontario. Farmers are being left in the dark about the ongoing dispute between the CFIA and 3 specific beef processing plants in Ontario, Mr. Speaker. The shutting down of these plants has caused many farmers to go into crisis. What is the immediate action that the minister is going to take to help these farmers impacted by the closures?
Minister of Agriculture.
We understand the resulting loss of capacity, of processing capacity, the closing of Riding Regency as on the beef sector, and the impact this can have on farmers' income. I can assure you that we are working with the industry and to find other ways to support the industry. Food safety is obviously a top priority for our government and for CFIA, and we have different programs ongoing, and we are supporting the industry. Thank you.
Honourable Député de Beauce.
Honourable Member for Beauce. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has totally abandoned farmers all across the country. They're worried for a number of reasons. Dairy and poultry producers still haven't been fully compensated. China is still interfering with the import of Western canola. And there's been a shortage of propane, which nearly caused a catastrophe in Ontario and Quebec. What will this government do to finally stand up for our farmers? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, the agricultural sector is extremely important to our government, and we are working with all stakeholders. For example, with supply management, we committed to give $1.75 million to our dairy farmers, and the first checks have already been received. The system is working, and I invite all farmers who haven't yet filled out the necessary paperwork to make their request as soon as possible so that they can receive their money. We are continuing discussions with China about canola as well.
Member for Bonavista Buren Trinity.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me express my gratitude to the residents of Bonavista Buren Trinity for re-electing me as their Member of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the offshore industry provides many opportunities for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to stay in the province and find good, well-paying jobs. It is an industry that builds our communities and has turned our province into a hub for the creation of new technologies and innovation. With recent news of an expected uptake in exploration activity, including multi-billion-dollar investments, can the Minister of Natural Resources please inform the House on his priorities for Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore industry?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
I appreciate the question from the member from Bonavista Buren Trinity. Canada's offshore industry has created economic benefits that reach families and communities right across the country through sustainable and responsible development. We do this through strong investments, regulatory stability, and meaningful relationships with stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, we are ensuring that Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore remains an attractive place to invest and create good jobs. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary, Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, today Canadians pay the same amount for 5 gigabytes of data as an American pays for 12 gigabytes. And the difference is even more stark when you compare what a European pays. It isn't fair to Canadians who are struggling to make ends meet, and it makes us uncompetitive. Over 4 years, the Liberals have always put Canada's big wireless companies first, as opposed to lowering costs for Canadians with innovative spectrum license designs or other ways of getting low-cost wireless access for Canadians. Why?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member opposite for a very thoughtful question on an issue that we campaigned on. We were very clear that we're going to actually reduce cell phone bills by 25%. And this is above and beyond the actions we have taken to help consumers. We brought forward a policy directive that makes it very clear for CRTC to make affordability front and center. We've also dealt with consumer-related issues when it comes to high-pressure sales tactics, which has led to a new wireless code of conduct, internet code of conduct as well, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to remain committed to making sure that we use spectrum in a strategic way to help consumers.
Honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, U.S. Customs and Border Patrols continues to open and review Canada Post mail going to Campobello Island. Campobello is Canadian territory, but is only accessible year-round by driving an hour through the state of Maine. The ongoing mail search by U.S. officials is an invasion of our privacy rights. It also challenges Canada's sovereignty. It is unacceptable. What is the federal government doing to safeguard the privacy rights of Canadians living on Campobello?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the very important question he asked. This is something, obviously, that he brought to my attention yesterday. We will be looking at this matter, and we'll have further things to say in the future on that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Member for Selkirk, Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government secretly slashed health care funding for our troops, leaving them vulnerable when they need help the most. Wow. Because of these Liberal cuts, in Ontario alone, hospitals are out of pocket by over $10 million and may start turning away military personnel seeking treatment. Wow. The Defence Minister owes our brave men and women in uniform a straight and simple answer. Will he restore full funding to military health care right across this country and reverse these callous cuts? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
And all members in this House that the health and well-being of our Canadian Armed Forces members is a top priority. Every member who is in need of medical service will get the top priority and the full support that's required. We are in discussions with the province when it comes to how members are charged, but we will work with the province. But one thing we'll make sure, Mr. Speaker, that every single member, if there's a need for any type of healthcare service, it will be to the top priority and the top class. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the residents of Kitchener-Conestoga for allowing me the privilege to serve here in Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, there are many students in my riding in Kitchener-Conestoga who are excited to work about the work on making post-secondary education more affordable. and they re-elected us to keep working so that more Canadians can afford higher education. Can the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion share with the House what progress we have made?
Great question.
Honourable Minister of Employment.
I'd like to thank the member from Kitchener-Conestoga for his question. Mr. Speaker, we know that education is vital to succeeding in our workforce. We're investing in Canadians so they reach their full potential. We started by giving students more support through Canada Student Grants. We expanded the eligibility for student loans and grants. We introduced a 6-month interest-free and payment-free grace period, and we lowered the interest rate on student loans. And that's not all. In our platform, we committed to further increasing Canada Student Grants by $1,200 and extending the grace period to 2 years. This is how we're making sure that every Canadian has the opportunity to succeed.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Talks about the importance of equal access to university and college, but it is only that, talk. Action is needed to ensure fair access to education based on your desire to learn, not your ability to pay. So why, while provinces are raising tuition fees and the government has happily written off billions in debt owed by big corporations, why is this government still gouging students and charging interest on federal government loans?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
I thank the honourable member for her question. I repeat, we know what a burden student loans put on Canadian students as they enter the workforce, and we're taking steps to make sure that we lessen that burden. That's why we're committed to increasing the grace period for repayment until 2 years, and we're increasing the amount of money an individual has to be making before they even start making these payments from $25,000, which was an increase in our past mandate, to $35,000 this year. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
And that ends question period for today. C'est la fin des questions pour...
This is the end of question period for today.
Give them a chance to clear out.